the cross for humanity. You gave yourself to save the world. Oh, to be like you. Oh, to be like you. Blessed Redeemer, to be as you are. Oh, to be like you. Oh, to be like you. Painting your picture of love on my heart.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fireside podcast.
Got him.
Got him. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fireside podcast, where our mission is to better engage culture, to equip the church, and to glorify God. I'm Houston.
I'm Clayton.
And I'm Jeremiah.
All right. Well, today we are here. You know, I always open up the podcast with, we're here today to talk to you about, obviously, we're always here, and so,
Sometimes we're sometimes present.
physically present.
Physically present for sure.
Today we want to talk about worship. So Jeremiah, why don't we just jump right in and you give us a succinct, I'm thinking 90-second definition of worship in all of its entirety. Go.
Of course, pick on the worship minister.
Mm-hmm.
It's your job.
I know.
It is literally your job.
It's kind of my job. Let's just say
It's your
kind of.
calling. Well, it's not your job.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to be reassured of that. Thank you. So worship. Well, let's just say one thing right off the bat, that worship is not just music. Music is an aspect of worship, but it is not conclusively worship. I think I could probably just say that and be fine.
Yeah, Jeremiah, that reminds me of what Paul says about our spiritual act of worship. And for those of you listening at home, you don't know this, but we have taken about 4 or 5 tries for me to quote that properly, and I've not done a good job. So, Jeremiah, we're just going to ask you to help us out with that quote.
Yeah, so Romans 12, 1 and 2 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." That's that whole section there. But when it says spiritual act of worship, it's actually better translated as reasonable service, which is actually what the King James Version says. So it's our reasonable service towards God that we present ourselves to him in that way.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that we shouldn't view this passage as an example of what worship is?
No, I think that's what I'm saying, is that worship is our reasonable service towards God. It's a reverence. It's a deep respect, a reverence for our Creator.
Yeah. That's good. So we had a lot of discussion before we started recording about what we were going to talk about today. We knew since last week that we would be talking about worship, but we had kind of disagreements, what we say, about what the implications would be for this episode specifically. Like what direction we wanted to run with this.
Yeah, because we all recognize that worship is something greater than just simply song, but when I suggested we should do worship, I mean, I was thinking songs.
Right. And of course, I'm not opposed to that, because that's what I do in the church each Sunday, is I lead the music for the congregation. And so I'm perfectly okay with the direction of this episode being songs in the church. and conveying the story behind those songs.
Yeah, Jeremiah, I'm reminded of a quote by Andrew Fletcher who said, "Let me make the songs of a nation, and I care not who makes the laws." And really the idea behind this quote is that the songs that we sing when we come together either identify, or I would probably argue shape, our culture and our community.
Very much so, because what we worship, we become.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, can you go dive a little deeper on that?
Yeah, so actually, this is pretty fresh in my mind because the sermon series that we're in at church right now is called Overload, and we're talking about making margin for God in your life. And I made this graphic that actually it's a cross. It's a depiction of the cross. It has all these things embedded in the cross, all these words that describe things that consume our lives that don't allow margin for God. These things include Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, pretty much all social media. I think I had on there, pornography is a big one. Just sin in general. I mean, there's, feelings of despair, like just all these things that we get so caught up on, and we just forget that there's a God that's greater than us, that we need to be paying attention more than anything else in our lives. And so if we worship these things that are consuming our time, we will thus become what the world wants us to become, because these are things that are consumed in the world that are taking us away from being consumed in the kingdom, being consumed in the ways of Christ, being consumed in the way that we talked about at the beginning of this episode, being transformed by the renewing of your mind.
So how does that relate to the songs that we sing in church? I mean, I think the average person coming into this, we touched on the idea that worship is more than just singing songs, but the average person coming into this is going to hear when we say worship, they're going to hear, saying good Father on Sundays. So how does what you're saying relate to the songs that we're singing when we come together?
Guys are just making me say everything today.
Oh yeah, brother.
Yeah,
this is our first interview episode. You should know that.
Little did you know.
Little did you know.
So the songs that we sing on a Sunday morning, most of them are taking ideas that are within our culture, just overarching culture. Ideas of, like you suggested, good Father as a song. Well, the beginning verses of that are, I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I know the tender whisper of love in the dead of nights. Just talking about how, we know what people say about you, but this is who you are, and this is what we know about you. And so, we're going to proclaim that. We're going to proclaim that together. We're countercultural. We're countercultural to the ideas of this world. We want people to recognize and know that you are a good Father, and we are loved by you, which is completely, like I'm saying, countercultural to anything that this world is going to offer. Gives us a lot of hope.
The audience should know that after what Jeremiah just said there, we've been struggling with what to come up with to say next. And that I think that speaks to something that I listen to about what worship does. Because what you said just then was it was really good, And what one person that I was listening to, I can't remember their name this week, was that worship doesn't necessarily just lead to an applause. It just doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't lead to some super celebration, but more of a residing in the silence and reflecting on just what we just encountered was a God that's so much bigger than us that we can't even do anything in response. We just sit and take him in.
Right, which exactly our point is that worship is not just music, even just being in complete silence and sitting and basking in the love of God. Just anticipating his presence by not moving and being silent.
Yeah, Clayton, I think the person you're talking about who said that is it Jennifer Donaldson?
Sounds right.
And I remember hearing her say that too, and it was challenging for me because, sometimes I think it was challenging to me because that's really a countercultural statement, like you were saying, Jeremiah. This idea that after this moment of intense music that was so effective in drawing us in, we are called to not, applaud the musician or anything like that. Like, we're called to silent reflection. And really, I think that's, we're called to give honor where honor's due, right? And in this situation, it's to the Lord. And so this moment of silent honor to the Lord is I like what you said, definitely worship.
And so I don't believe I explained how a song like Good, Good Father is countercultural. Just, the idea of a good, good father is not something that resonates with a lot of people. And I think we talked about this on a previous episode even, that, like I myself, I just don't have a great relationship with my father. And so when I hear the words, good, good father, that's not necessarily something I attribute to, the world, to worldly standards. But knowing that I do have a good, good father in heaven, it just brings me so much peace, and it just creates an avenue for me to worship, because it's not what I'm used to. It's something that I can appreciate more because it's not something I had.
So if I can butt in, it seems like what you're saying is that sometimes musical worship is worship because it illuminates truths that we might not otherwise be paying attention to. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's completely fair to say.
And so I mean, touching back on this Chris Tomlin song, what a powerful song for our culture and specifically our generation to hear, that we've got, a good father in heaven.
Technically, it's not Chris Tomlin.
Oh, who is it?
It's originally by House Fires.
Is it really? I didn't know that.
But then Chris Tomlin picked it up. My
apologies, House Fires. We got to give honor where honor is due. So, this is an important song for our culture right now because it speaks to the nature of God in contrast to our culture. And I think that's a cool segue into something that is really important for me in worship. And I'm by no means a worship leader. Musically declined. But I pick out songs for my church worship, and we just kind of sing along to music. We're a real small church, and thankfully that works for us. But when I pick out songs, one of my highest criteria, besides quality, is theology. And I want to make sure that the songs that we sing on Sunday have good theology behind them. So this past Sunday, we sang the song "Though You Slay Me" by Shane and Shane. And I had a very specific pair of people in mind when I picked the song. And that's what I try to do, is kind of think we've got a really big range. My wife and I are in our lower 20s, and we've got our pastor is in his 40s, and we've got a couple that are in their 70s, and so we've got such a wide range that I always try to do something that's going to click with everybody, is really the idea. But anyways, we have these two guys in our church right now who are really dealing with some serious suffering coming their way. And that's what at least they think that serious suffering is coming their way. They're waiting on some test results and that kind of thing. And one of them said to the church last Sunday when we were just kind of spending time in prayer, he said, I think that this suffering I'm going to go through is punishment for my life before I became a believer, some 30 years ago or whatever. And, not even to touch on that. I mean, I don't want to talk about that. What I heard was from him, I'm going to be suffering because God is punishing me. And so when I hear this song, Though You Slay Me by Shane and Shane, the first thing I think is that regardless of your theology about suffering, that the singer is crying out to God because he feels betrayed and destroyed by our Father. And he says, and still I'll worship you. And to me, that is a constant flow and undercurrent in all the Psalms, is although I am suffering and I'm crying out to you why, I'm still going to worship you, Lord. And so, I remember listening to the song and just thinking how powerful this is. Just the sentiment that we're going to worship despite our own sufferings because he's still worthy.
Which is exactly what Revelation 4 and 5 is speaking into, and what our sermon in chapel this week was about, was, even in our suffering, we can worship God. And it's not something that we have to just, make them separate entities in our lives. Mm-hmm. No, we carry our suffering with us through the process.
Yeah.
I know, right? That chapel service, the whole time I was just thinking, oh my gosh, this is what we're talking about this week in our podcast. Like, oh my gosh, the Spirit's working. But, just identifying with our suffering and how even in the midst of it, we worship the Creator. Oof.
And I think it's interesting that you say the Creator there specifically, because that verse, or that line, though you slay me, actually comes from Job. And it is one of his last 2 or 3 monologues before God steps in and starts talking. And I remember I because I loved the song and I knew the people in my church were having a hard time with it, I went and looked up, what the history of the song, or the origin of the song was, and it's a passage in Job. And I understand that we have to be careful when we take passages from Job, because there's, his 3 friends just lie to him the whole time. But this is Job speaking, and he says this line, though you slay me, still I will worship you. And eventually God, he does his whole diatribe on, I am the Creator and I deserve worship. Regardless of how you feel or your experiences, I still deserve worship. But he eventually commends Job because he didn't succumb to the lies of his friends, although he, was suffering and crying out. And he re-elevates Job for his faithfulness. And so that song makes me think about this idea that you're saying, Clayton, that in the midst of suffering, we still worship our great Creator.
Yeah, what you were saying there really hits home for me. As for Revelation class, I'm actually writing a paper over the very last chapter of Revelation, the end of the book. And I think I talked about this on last week's episode a little bit too, but I've got more of a framework for what I'm wanting to talk about, and how obedience actually ensures our restoration. But I think we could even change that a little bit and say that worship is what ensures our restoration. Because when we are being restored into the image we are created, or even restored into the new Eden, it is through our worship, the way that we revere God and we have deep respect for Him. And that is the emphasis of worship, is for us to revere God and to be faithfully obedient to Him in our reverence for Him.
So we've talked a lot about just kind of worship in general here, and we've said kind of our piece on some different components of worship and some different components of song worship. But Clayton, when you suggested this theme, it seemed like you had a clear idea of how we were going to connect this subject of worship to story and our stories. Do you want to touch on that?
I think what the primary reason why I was wanting to do songs with worship was because of how connected story and songs go together, and that through these songs that we sing, we are retelling something about our history or something about who we want to become. Just those two things, our history and who we want to become.
Yeah, so a song that comes to mind when you say our history, I'm thinking of the song "This I Believe." I believe in God our Father, I believe in Christ the Son. It's from the Nicene Creed. Like, that's where that song comes from. And so it's almost this teaching moment that we can have with the church. Is like, these are traditional practices, saying creedal statements together. Like, this is what we believe. And so yeah, that's the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned history. This is what the church has always done in worship is proclaim what they believe, and that's what songs do in the church.
Kindly you gave your mercy, govern my shame and brokenness. Set this wandering sinners high. Hard to be like you, oh, to be like you. Blessed Redeemer, to be as you are. Oh, to be like you, oh, to be like you. Painting your picture of love on my heart.
Yeah, Jeremiah, when preparing for this episode, one of the things that I kind of landed on is that, we all agree there are multiple types of worship and aspects to worship, but some of the things that we want to talk about, we're singing, songs, of course. But another thing that I thought would be really cool to touch on is liturgy in general. And this is something that I've been really pursuing for the past couple months is an idea of liturgy, especially being someone who has some say over what our church services are looking like. I'm starting to realize more and more the value of a structure that people can buy into. And really, before just we do anything else, I don't feel qualified at all to talk about liturgy, because the more I pursue it, the more it becomes ethereal to me. Like, I can't put a peg on what it is. Can you give us a word on even what liturgy means?
So I would describe liturgy as traditional practices or a form or forms in which we worship. And so it goes back to, what I was just mentioning with this, I believe, implementing these creedal statements within our worship services, implementing prayer time, where we can pray together as a community, implementing times of silence, like we talked about earlier as well. Also, implementing communal reading of Scripture together. Just being able to read the Word of God out loud together is very much worshipful. And so, yeah, that's really my take on liturgy, or just liturgical practices in general. I mean, there are things that are just have been traditionally practiced throughout the history of the church, and I think that's what Robert E. Weber was getting at with his whole ancient future idea of worship, where we are essentially combining, the old with the new. And I mean, he's got plenty of books. He's got his book Ancient Future Worship, and then he's got Worship Old and New. I mean, he's got even a college dedicated to him and his ideas about worship out in Florida, which is the Robert E. Weber Institute of Worship. Just a phenomenal voice. I mean, he's passed away now, but just a phenomenal voice in the realm of worship and what it truly is, and really bringing it back to its roots, but also, you know, in a way, bringing it into our culture today of worship and how we should merge the two.
Yeah, so along this idea of liturgy as something that what'd you say? What was the first thing you said like that?
Traditional practices,
practices.
A form or forms of practices.
So why do some of these churches do liturgy versus, you know, not? And I think a lot of what the reason for that is because it gives them something that is literally beyond them. They did not come up with this, but they are given the words that help guide them to something that they may not be able to appreciate or even come up with on their own. Like, it's a statement about how I don't know how to pray, or I don't even know how to come up with the words to say. Mm-hmm. And the liturgy provides that for you and helps you guide your direction towards God. And man, that's one of the aspects that I love about Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, is that they recognize the fact that when you come to the Mass or church and on Sunday morning or whenever, that you are now participating between this merger of heaven and earth, and you are at the throne of God, sitting there with the saints, worshiping. And man, if we don't come with that in mind sometimes, we are missing out on something.
Yeah, it ceases to be worship. Like there's a quote that I was mentioning before that, you know, of Warren Wiersbe, that when worship becomes pragmatic, it ceases to be worship.
Tell us what you mean by pragmatic.
When it becomes, you know, practical, when it becomes a show, you know, like when it becomes buffet style church, you know, like when we're just coming to eat some junk food to get us hyped up for the week and then go back out into the world, you know, like you can call it your Mountain Dew and Doritos diet. It's more than that.
So Clayton, you were talking about how in maybe our church traditions today, we do not pay a lot of honor to the idea of borrowing someone else's way of doing church, essentially. That we don't, in evangelical churches today, we have a bad habit, maybe, of not relying on tradition or church history or even other people to help us worship, right? So something that I think about is in a lot of the churches that I've been to, if we were to implement, actually you said this, Jeremiah, if we were to implement communal scripture reading, where everybody stands up, reads scripture, and then sits back down, people, their first response is, oh, that's a Catholic thing. We don't do that. And so I think when we do that, we have a bad habit of, you know, I always say this, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So we can acknowledge that what Jeremiah is saying is 100% right, that when worship becomes pragmatic, when it becomes a show, when it becomes a set of motions, when it becomes, you know, just a thing that we just go through, then it's not worship, it has no value. But we can also acknowledge what you're saying, Clayton, that when we engage with the works of other people, their songs, their prayers, even their liturgical practices, we have an opportunity to really engage in something bigger than us. And so how do we keep those two things in tension? How do we not fall into the pitfalls of, well, this is what we do because this is what we do, and at the same time, we don't fall into the pitfalls of spontaneity is synonymous with spirit-filled. And does that make sense when I say? And so what I mean by that is we kind of get to this point where if every part of our service is not spontaneous, it's not filled with the Spirit. We kind of assume that the Spirit only moves on Sunday mornings, right? Instead of all week when we're preparing for service. So how do we kind of keep these things in tension? Because I think that's our challenge as leaders in the church and as believers, that we are to keep these things in tension. We have to recognize that other people can bring value to the table. And not just that there are people who lived before us who were incredibly brilliant and brought a lot of value to the table. And then, we have to always be careful that we don't just do things to do them. This is real. This is an important experience. So, do you guys have any tips? And Jeremiah, you're doing this in your church right now. Do you have anything that you're seeing as valuable for keeping these two things in tension?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is redefining what worship is to the congregation and having intentional moments within your service to teach your congregation what worship really is, and that it's not just the music, even though that's what we're talking about today. We're supposed to be talking about. And so the ways that I've been doing this recently within our church is presenting a worship emphasis for each week, where in between we usually have a pretty set structure of how things are going. And so we usually, after our welcome period, we have 2 songs before we go into the sermon. And in between those 2 songs, I will stop and have us do something like an extended prayer time or communal reading of scripture, and just lead into that with, these are things that have traditionally been done and that are valuable, and that we should recognize these things as worshipful moments as well. Not that song is not worship, because that's not what we're saying, but I think we've synonymized worship with song in the church, and I think it's very important to just pull away from that as much as possible, because when we do that too, it identifies the worship leader as the only person worshiping on a Sunday morning, if that makes sense. As in, his identity is already made up. He's no more than the guy that leads songs, because worship is synonymous with music, with song. And so even what I've seen as the new title for that is creative arts pastor or creative arts minister, because it takes you away from being classified as just the music guy in your church. And we need to realize that, even the worship minister has a lot of value to bring to the table aside from just leading songs on a Sunday morning. He's there to be a minister like anybody else in the church. And so that's just, for me personally, that's the biggest reason why I've attempted to implement these things in our services and to redefine the meaning of worship.
So if I can just jump in and try to summarize, you're saying that being intentional about telling people why we're doing this stuff is how you're bridging the gap between touching on old valuable subjects and still keeping it spirit-filled.
Correct.
So Jeremiah and Clayton, definitely Clayton too, because I know you've got opinions on this. How much of a role does the quality of worship play in the worship setting? And so what I mean by that is the quality of song, singing, music, that kind of thing. How much of a role in worship does that play?
So to begin with, what makes worship begins with, it has to be set apart, meaning whatever is done has to be holy in a sense. And that it is not something normal, but it's not something that is completely abstract. It's concrete, but it is something, set apart. And that can be challenging. I recognize that. But, and the reason why it has to be so holy is because we're giving this to God, and He is holy. Now, and the second part, that was the first one, I guess. I think it needs to be edifying to the church. And this is, I think, what you're talking about how it teaches the church who she is. And in a lot of ways, it's the church teaching herself, I guess. But it has to be edifying to the church. Go ahead, Jeremiah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I believe I think it's in Bonhoeffer's Life Together. He actually touches on this a little bit, where he talks about corporate worship, and its purpose is to glorify God first and foremost, but to edify the church. I mean, these are the two things that we're supposed to keep in mind when we are, quote unquote, planning our worship services. That everything needs to first and foremost glorify God, but we need to have something within our service that's edifying. Otherwise, there's no value to what we're doing. There's no value to the kingdom.
Well, I'm using this word. What does that mean? What does that mean, Jeremiah?
Teachable, teaching.
Yes.
Yeah, like
Edifying.
Yeah.
Useful for growing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that Jennifer Donaldson said that really stuck out to me was that if we can acknowledge that something is good and edifying and holy, and of quality, so if we can recognize all of these things, then we should acknowledge it as beautiful, just as a response to our human nature, right? So again, the idea is that if we know something has good theology and is glorifying to God and is edifying to the church and is done well, if it's got all of these components, we should recognize it as beautiful. And either we do that because it responds to our imago Dei, that our image of God inside of ourselves, or we have to teach ourselves to appreciate the beauty of it. I really enjoyed what she said there, because I think something that sticks out to me, again, picking songs for a congregation that's very spread out, is that the hymns are such a powerful tool for us to use in the church, because so many people get to connect instantly to it. We don't have to go through a process of buy-in in the songs. So when we start to sing the hymn, Jesus paid it all. People have spent their whole lives singing along to these hymns, and they have, whether initially or over time, come to appreciate the beauty of these. And so that's just a really, really cool thing to me, is this idea that sometimes we have to teach ourselves what's good, and that seems crazy in our consumer world. And well, if it doesn't fit you, it doesn't fit you. But that's not how worship works. Especially as a community, we have to acknowledge that everybody's going to have differences in opinions and tastes and preferences, but your preferences and tastes and opinions don't determine what's good or good for your congregation or good for you even, right? There's so much value in learning to appreciate beauty in worship. And again, I mean those 4 points. There's so much value in learning to appreciate that as opposed to instantly recognizing it.
Yeah, so why is it that these songs have value over time? Or why is it that when we sing a song like Jesus Paid It All, a song that's been sung for a lot of people their whole lives in church, it's because that there are countless stories connected to that song in their lives as they grew up in the church. So many situations that song has led them through. And that's essentially what we're doing. When we choose songs on a Sunday morning, we're creating a hymnal for our church.
What you spoke about just then, Houston, really reminds me of just how I, when I first became a Christian and going to church, and just JJ can attest to this, just how much I hated worship.
This is very true.
Really?
Yeah, I
Hated singing.
hated singing, why do we got to do this? This is just ridiculous.
Yeah, can't we just shut up and hear the sermon, right?
Yeah, I just can't. Yeah. And boy, my community can probably just, reflect upon just how much that was true of me. But now, like, I think about how I go to church, and well, sometimes sure I don't want to sing,
Mm-hmm.
but how much more I appreciate worship now, and how I didn't teach myself how more important it was, but it really was my community who taught me, because I saw in them, no, this is important, and this is how we go about doing this.
Yeah, it's that humility when we approach this, and really everything in the Christian walk, but it's our humility and how we approach that. If someone else is finding value in this, then I can also find value in it if I let myself.
Right. It goes back to being transformed by the renewing of our mind. And when we do that, we leak, that's a good word, I guess. We leak out the attributes of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why community is so important, and why, your Clayton, why your idea of worship changed is because, like you were saying, you saw these attributes being poured out around you, and you realized that there was something different here, and there's something that is to be appreciated here. And that's exactly why worship is so important in our church on a Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And not even just a Sunday morning, just when we wake up in the morning, praising God, thanking Him for another day of life, that we have breath to live another day. That worship should not just be in this building on Sunday morning, but it should be before you even get there. Every aspect of your life should be worship, because you are created in the image of the Creator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think in order to wrap this kind of up, you said one line that I think stuck out for me through this podcast, is that we worship, what we worship, we become. And I think that's kind of what we're really, really getting at.
Mm-hmm.
That we are becoming something different, and that something different is really about Jesus and
not us.
and not us.
Yeah. Yeah. All too easy to make it about us, even in worship. Yeah, so if we could encourage you to walk away from this with one thing, I always say that at the end of our episodes. If we can encourage you to walk away with one thing, to me, it would be to acknowledge that when we come to worship, it's truly not about you. And obviously, we want to create environments that are conducive for worship for other people, but sometimes that doesn't mean environments that people enjoy. It doesn't mean environments that people
Are happy about.
Yeah. And we're not saying, all you worship leaders go home and, start making your church miserable. but
No, hear the truth of what we're saying.
yeah, what we're saying is that you need to come again in humility and understand that if someone picked this song for today, it could still offer value for your life, regardless of whether or not you like it, regardless of whether or not the style is what you appreciate. If we boil worship down to a set of feelings that we get on Sunday, then we've missed a big point in it. We've lost it. And again, that's what I want to emphasize. That worship's not about your tastes and preferences. It's about His. It's about God's, right?
Yeah, and in understanding the reason why you're feeling that way, I think is what the church is supposed to be doing. Is teaching that edifying process of, why is it, that I feel this way when we sing a song that, glorifies God? Well, it's because that's who God always wanted you to be, and that's who he wants you to become. And this is just how we teach the church. I don't really know what else to say beyond that. Just continue to teach people that there is value to everything that's being done, or at least there should be value.
That's good.
To everything that is done on a Sunday morning, so that people don't leave the church and not continue to worship throughout their week.
Are there anything you guys want to say? Hey, thanks for this or that? I've got one. If ever there exists a world where people know us and they don't know the Cultivated podcast, then I would encourage you to check it out. I've just stumbled upon it. Mike Cosper, I don't know much about the guy, but I know he's a part of the Gospel Coalition, and I know that he talks a lot about worship. And I also know that the way he talks about worship just blows my mind. It's just incredible. I just got one of his books, Faith Mapping. Really excited to jump into that. I would encourage you that if you want to know more about worship and specifically about kind of engaging our culture and worship at the same time, I would encourage you to check out the Cultivated podcast.
Yeah, and someone along those lines is Andy Crouch, who is actually on the Cultivated podcast. He has a 2-part episode that's phenomenal. Another worship guy that...
Listen to the second one.
Yeah, well,
Don't
I mean,
just rip it off
if
the
you
first
enjoy
one.
worship and you want to hear the story behind how he got to where he is, the first one's a really good
That's true,
lead into
yeah.
the second one. So, also some other resources I guess I could throw out there. Bob Kaufman has a book called Worship Matters, which is phenomenal for any of those that are aspiring to do worship in their church. Musical worship, I should say. Robert E. Weber has influenced me in everything that I do. So definitely check out any of his works.
If someone wanted to engage in some of this liturgy we've been talking about, what kind of resources could they reach out for?
Robert E. Weber.
What about our person who gives us...
Oh,
Another person that we'd like to shout out to is Rich Kirkpatrick, who's been allowing us to use their music from a beautiful liturgy. Him and his daughter Emily. He has a blog, which is rkblog.com, and just a phenomenal resource for just anything that you would want to know in the worship realm. I mean, he just released an article that's about how to leave your church if you're having issues in your church and you feel like you're called to leave. Just the way you should go about doing that. And it was a really good read. So, but yeah, like I said, anything that involves, worship ministry, you could go to his blog and find countless amounts of resources.
and this guy's been doing worship for a long time, right?
Yeah, he's actually one of the workshop speakers for the National Worship Leader Convention.
Mm-hmm.
He's done that for a lot of years now. And so if you ever make your way to one of those conventions, make sure that you pop into one of his seminars, because it's definitely worth it.
Cool. All right. It's all you.
What are we going to talk about next week?
I actually have an idea for you guys.
No way.
Yep. Are you shocked?
No. About time.
We are planning to have our buddy Travis Montgomery on. Pastor, local church, guy we went to school with, just all around great guy. And he suggested that we could talk about, he said, the divisive nature of the gospel. And I thought, oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So I asked him to clarify. And he said he meant how the story of the gospel calls people into decision. And the power of that story, that you can't walk away exactly the same from the gospel. That it requires you to make a decision.
Oh, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and he referenced Donald Miller while we were talking about it, which just, warmed my heart to no end. Do you know about Donald Miller? Wrote Blue Like Jazz. Oh man, love that guy. Anyways, so if that's good with you guys, I say we get rolling with it.
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So join us next week with Travis Montgomery, and we're going to talk about the gospel being a call to decision. Thanks, guys.
I count all this loss to claim my reward, to be more like you, I am yours. All that I am, I bring it to you. From this moment on, I am yours. I count all this loss to claim my reward, to be more like you, I am yours. Oh, to be like you. Blessed Redeemer, to be as you are.